The Royal Cambodian Palace, where Mrs. John F. Kennedy comes to fulfill a childhood dream. Accompanied by Prince Sihanouk and Queen Mother Cossamak, she watches the royal elephants approach. The feeding of the giant animals is a tricky business, and Mrs. Kennedy is both startled and delighted by the peppy royal pachyderms. An exchange of gifts and the brief visit is ended. With Mrs. Kennedy is Lord Horrocks during the 9-day tour of temples, palaces, and exotic landmarks.
Madame Menon, Son Excellence Menon, Ambassadeur de l'Inde.
Mrs. Kennedy is happy to be here, and that Prince Sihanouk is happy to have her here. There are no airport speeches, but the Prince remarked the other day that Mrs. Kennedy enjoys the esteem and gratitude of the world because she has a very great character, and because her husband, he said, behaved very well and was a sincere friend to all countries, including Cambodia. He charged there had been aggressions along his country's border with South Vietnam. He's also denied that Viet Cong forces were using frontier areas as sanctuaries. Mrs. Kennedy will spend about a week in Cambodia, but just a day or two in this capital city of Phnom Penh. She will stay at the Royal Palace here. It's a masterpiece of Cambodian architecture. It looks half fairy tale, half Hollywood. It was Prince Sihanouk himself who broke off diplomatic relations with the United States in 1965. Now, with Mrs. Kennedy's visit and Prince Sihanouk's recent criticism of Communist China, there's speculation that her trip here might produce a warming up of relations between the two countries. But the Prince has anticipated that speculation, and he has said that, despite Mrs. Kennedy's visit, Cambodia will not move toward any rapprochement with the United States. Nevertheless, there is, right now, with Mrs. Kennedy here, a dramatic, if unofficial, American presence in Cambodia for the first time in more than 2 years. The Chinese Communists, the North Vietnamese, and the Viet Cong's representatives, all of whom have missions here in Phnom Penh, are not present. There's also no American ambassador, and that's one of the reasons why Mrs. Kennedy's visit is regarded as having not only tourist importance, but even political significance.
So, here we are, November 1967, and as we've heard from our newsman there, the visit of Jackie Kennedy to Cambodia. First to Phnom Penh and then on to Angkor. This was apparently the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. And by all accounts of this not quite political visit, the widow Kennedy had a wonderful time exploring the skeletal remains of the Angkorian era. She was able to wander around as most tourists do, at your leisure, marveling at the great structures, probably enjoying the sun and the heat. And while a day or two exploring Angkor can be a little taxing, it seems that it was the moments she spent with Sihanouk that were really tiring. Sihanouk had invited her to visit, and she had obliged, but you, my dear listener, would naturally think that there might be some other potential reasons for this well-publicised visit. As the newsie said, this visit had political significance, and even perhaps more than you might assume, as we'll find out. Anyway, as you gathered from the reportage there, she was given an essentially royal reception, presented with elaborate silver plates and bowls, and of course some of Sihanouk's jazz records. They travelled to Sihanoukville on the southwest coast, where the prince unveiled a street named after Jackie's late husband. Now, a Time magazine article about the visit mentioned that she had actually requested Sihanouk to remove a couple of parts from the speech that he made at the dedication of the street. Lines that said that if President Kennedy had lived, that the US wouldn't still be at war in Vietnam. Perhaps Jackie is simply not fond of historical counterfactuals. Or perhaps the reason that this was removed from the speech is that there were some interested parties in Washington that didn't find that notion quite appropriate. Now, for Sihanouk, he was obviously enchanted by Jackie Kennedy, as many were, almost displaying, fanboyishness at times. But he also knew how to use a crowd. He used her celebrity as a means to broadcast his own political messages, perhaps to this slightly larger and more interested audience than he would usually receive. Her visit was able to signal boost, to borrow a modern phrase, a few of his usual comments, a condemnation of US imperialism here, a pointing out of the bombings that were causing deaths there, and of course about America coming to exploit Asia. But the US foreign policy boys back in Washington were probably ready for a fair bit of bluster and the occasional condemnation of America, coming out of Sihanouk's mouth. Perhaps the worst example had actually already been said by the prince 4 years earlier, when he had stopped just short of openly thanking divine forces for killing Kennedy in Dallas, for what he thought was an appropriate punishment to the president as an enemy of the peaceful and neutral Cambodia. Now, generally speaking, thanking God for killing another politician isn't the kind of thing that, it leaves a sour taste in someone's mouth, doesn't it? And this faux pas that probably best exemplifies the split in the two countries' diplomatic relationship was still, lingering. So one wonders why, indeed, the wife of the man that Sihanouk had, thanked God for killing, why was she visiting his country at the end of 1967? What was going on in the background? And perhaps these were matters that were so pressing that the State Department wouldn't mind handing over the metaphorical, well, it's not even metaphorical, it's almost a literal microphone to Sihanouk, giving him the spotlight and letting him go on a bit of a rant. Well, both parties had some reasons to be edging toward shaking hands again diplomatically, even if there was a forced smile and, the convenient forgetting of gaffes. And one was mentioned by the lovely news presenter. Sihanouk had openly discussed the trials and tribulations occurring in the People's Republic of China as this, or to put it lightly, unwelcome and perhaps unpredictable state of affairs. The Cultural Revolution, which we spent the last episode exploring, had seen pretty much the abandonment of traditional diplomatic decorum. Embassies had been burned, diplomats harassed, and we saw the primacy of Mao Zedong thought so thoroughly endorsed that, embers of that revolutionary fire had drifted downwind to Cambodia's Sino-Khmer population, symbolized by the throngs of people waving little red books, not to mention its effect on the native communist movement in the shape of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, but I suppose Sihanouk would only have been able to presume its effects in that case. Sihanouk had been, grasping at levers that he might be able to pull in order to maintain this delicate balancing act that by 1967, he'd been pursuing for more than a decade. Now, he'd long considered the United States war in Vietnam to be a losing one, and also that he sort of doubted that they would stick around even if they did win. So, he had been covertly, and not so covertly, dealing with the North Vietnamese and the Southern Viet Cong to better suit their needs. This was in the hope that it would guarantee his country some benefits once the war was over. Now, China, on the other hand, had been a much more easygoing, strings-free benefactor than the United States had been, if not a far less lucrative one. But their channeling of the tools of war to the communist Vietnamese struggle through Cambodia's western port, the one that Sihanouk had named a street after Kennedy in, overland to the bases on the border. This had been a clandestine conveyor belt that the Cambodian government and army was, welcome to keep a couple of boxes here and there for themselves, in exchange for its continued operation. But no matter what he had done to try and earn their gratitude, he faced a growing communist insurgency in his own country. And after the Sam Laut Rebellion in April 1967, Sihanouk became convinced that there was a genuine effort to overthrow his government coming from within his country's own borders, although the exact shape and the allegiances were still shrouded in mystery for him. But he did know that he was surrounded by communist countries that were seemingly not able to mitigate the growth of what he called the Khmer Rouge, or perhaps worse, maybe they were actually actively supporting them. And as we've seen over the last 2 episodes, the story's a bit more complicated than that, but we'll explore those factors again here. In any case, Sihanouk was looking around slightly anxiously at, who was left to help balance things out once more. And there, across the dance floor, was the United States. And they were not without their own reasons to meet the prince halfway. Despite Sihanouk's constant assurances that there was no way that the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong were using Cambodian territory as some kind of sanctuary in order to facilitate the war effort, which he did know and, allowed to do so. Now, the US began to be a little bit more direct in their desire to stop that from happening. And Jackie Kennedy was a convenient foot into a door conveniently left ajar, and as we will see, a far more attractive package than what the alternative might have been. So as Sihanouk lurches from one side of the political spectrum to the other, both domestically and internationally, the prospects for rapprochement, great word by the way, was becoming a real possibility with the United States, despite Sihanouk, pouting and saying there was no chance during Jackie Kennedy's tour. And despite him saying that there was no chance of this happening, well, just a couple of months later, a more official visit would take place, with a high-ranking US official, the highest that Sihanouk had seen in many years. And it's going to have serious and long-lasting consequences, this meeting, in January of 1968. And it comes at a time where Sihanouk had begun to grow more concerned about just how much and just how freely the communist Vietnamese were beginning to use his territory for their war. And the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the Khmer Rouge, well, they were beginning to plan for their next venture into open-ended armed struggle against the former king. A new revolutionary war, national in scope. They were devising a plan, gathering strength, weapons and recruits, eager to test their revolutionary credentials, once and for all, as the Cambodian Civil War will finally begin. Hello everyone, welcome back to In the Shadows of Utopia. I'm Lachlan Peters, and this is the beginning of the Cambodian Civil War, Part 2. Now, before we discuss this period of history, I'd just like to thank everyone again who's donated to the show, whether that was a one-time payment through PayPal or on a regular basis through Patreon. Just a reminder that you can support the show for as little as $1 a month, and in doing so, you'll gain access to a few things. A full audio commentary track of the film The Killing Fields, as well as this new thing I'm doing where after I release an episode, I'll sit down for about 10 minutes and record a video just talking about some wider insights that might have not made it into the final edit, things like that. Just allowing me to kind of step out of the format a little bit and think out loud. Please visit the website, www.shadowsofutopia.com, for more information about how you can support the show and sort of where some of the money goes once you have decided to do so. And again, you must be sick of hearing it every time and on every single podcast, but if you do want to support the show financially, that would be great. If you want to support it just with a good review and a rating wherever you are listening to it, that would be fantastic too. That's much appreciated. All right, with the podcasting stuff out of the way, let's continue the story with a brief recap there in the introduction. You'll recall that we last left, this part of the Cambodian part of the story, before that brief sojourn to the Cultural Revolution. So that was important to do because, as you saw in the intro, the effects of the Cultural Revolution do spread to Cambodia. And, this is to link us back up to the first part of the beginning of the Cambodian Civil War, where we covered the Samlaut Rebellion in Battambang in April 67, the fallout from this, spontaneous kind of uprising, the heavy-handed approach that Sihanouk and his Prime Minister Lon Nol took to, crush that rebellion, as well as the escape of the last, public-facing communists in Cambodian politics. They sort of went into hiding. That was Khieu Samphan, Ho Yon, and Hu Nim, the so-called three ghosts. Sort of martyrs now in the eyes of many observers, communist sympathizers, youth, and activists in general. And now, the CPK, having seen a small-scale uprising in practice, were determined to bring a full national-scale revolutionary war to Sihanouk, despite their Vietnamese or Chinese minders telling them to hold their horses. In this episode, the intertwining forces at play in the Cold War in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in China, will one by one lock into place, and a disaster will become inevitable. Okay, so let's pick back up the story with the CPK. And we rejoined Pol in the aftermath of a few tense meetings that they had with the Vietnamese, their until very recently nearby jungle-based neighbours, almost bunk buddies, in the area near Tay Ninh on the South Vietnamese border. Now, the Communist Party of Kampuchea had successfully made the case to their comrades that they should maintain a new headquarters, a new Office 100, further north in the hills and jungles of Cambodia's northeastern region, Rattanakkari. Pol himself had actually stayed behind in the old location just for a bit longer than, he sort of stays behind and tidies up the place. But in November 1967, he finally makes the trip into the northeast. Now, he actually has to make this trip, the majority of it, being carried in a hammock due to a serious case of malaria. And this is something that I think we brought up all the way back when we were talking about the Vietnamese experience at Dien Bien Phu, where I think there's this kind of tacit assumption that people have where people that are native to the region are kind of more resilient to this disease just naturally. And, it's only the colonial troops that would be badly affected by it. Now, remember, this isn't the case. And in Philip Short's biography of Pol, he quotes a Viet Cong official who actually claimed that malaria was a worse problem than the Americans. Like, he personally said that for every year he spent in the jungle, he would spend up to 2 months of that time in hospital battling the disease, and that many, many of their own forces would die from it. In fact, was it not for a Viet Cong medical base hidden in the jungles that they sort of passed by on their way to Rattanakkari, which had quinine available, it's possible that Pol Pot could have died 7 years before the fall of Phnom Penh, and that would be an interesting counterfactual, wouldn't it? Indeed, one of the CPK's zone leaders at this time, Mang, who was the leader of the southwest region, he dies of malaria in early 1968, and this will pave the way for his underling, Ta Mok, who will one day soon be known as the Butcher. He replaces Mang soon after. Pol will recover after he arrives at the new Office 100, and soon the wives of the 3 former students in Paris, Khieu Ponari, that's Sar's partner, Khieu Tirit, Yang Saris, and the sister of Ponari, and Yun Yat, who is Son Sen's wife, that they'll all join them in this jungle base. And here, finally left to their own devices, although there was a Vietnamese base not too far away, they're basically going to sit down and devise their plans for a renewed nationwide armed resistance, and they're going to project to begin in the new year. This is kind of like the little brother finally moving out from under the wing of the, in his opinion, overbearing elder brother or parent. They've got their own place and they're going to make their own war. But just like those first few weeks when you move out on your own, you sort of realise when you look around, you don't really have much stuff. But at least you've got your freedom, right? So, like the kid in their late teens or early 20s proudly showing off their mattress that was supported by a makeshift bed frame, made up of milk crates, or the many, many superfluous couches that they had, but just because they could bring them into their share house from the side of the street. So too were the Communist Party of Kampuchea, proud to have their Khmer base that was all theirs, despite its, bare-bonedness. Clusters of thatched huts in dense forest, surrounded by camouflaged booby traps, hidden in the ground with bamboo spears. Something homely. Even the guards patrolling the encampment were using bows and arrows, and they literally had a handful of actual guns. And most of them were from the First World War, and a few hunting rifles that the local tribesmen used. And if you get the impression that there is a kind of tribesman vibe to the defences here, you wouldn't be wrong. Recall that the local ethnic groups, the highland peoples like the Jarai, Brau and Kachak, often referred to under this umbrella term, Montagnards, these were the indigenous peoples to these regions. And they had been purposefully acclimated into the aims of the revolutionary Cambodians, who, as far away as they may have been in terms of their familiarity with, Marxist rhetoric, they did find alliance in their mutual distrust of the Sihanouk regime, and perhaps in a few considered ways for the Cambodian communists, a kind of ideological reflection of the commune part of communism that they saw in aspects of these Montagnards' lives. Pol Pot and Yang Sari would actually later claim that they were inspired by these folk with no property and no money. To them, they were, the purest examples of Maoist rhetoric about the so-called poor and blank vessels of revolution. Hundreds of these tribespeople from Ratanakiri will be recruited into the CPK and even be used as the leadership's most trusted bodyguards. But romantic as it may have been for some of these communist leaders, a handful of guns and some guys with a good bow and arrow is not exactly match for the more than 30,000 strong Royal Cambodian Army. So proud as they were of their new jungle base, their independence and their pointed sticks, and their declarations of armed struggle, well, now they actually had to go out there and make it a reality. Historian Steve Heder has some great insights on what making that plan basically consists of, where the Cambodians can once again, lean over and look at their classmates working out and try and copy as much as possible. He claims in Cambodian Communism and the Vietnamese model that in launching their nationwide armed struggle, the CPK was following a fairly well-trodden path that utilised the Maoist People's War strategy and the Vietnamese example of that People's War strategy that they utilised in South Vietnam from 1956 to 1960. So just to refresh your memory, they had formed armed teams who spread the communist message locally, then began killing local officials, then small attacks on government outposts, then spreading out attacks to destroy government administration of an area, and then finally, as he says, quote, switching to widespread use of terror, or as they would put it, destruction of the oppression, combined first with concerted uprisings in one province and then simultaneous uprisings in many provinces. End quote. So you've got a nucleus that needs protection with guns, which they had just about got covered. Like the leadership needs to be protected. So that's step one. Then, in almost like an extremely violent version of that trading game where, the person starts with like a paperclip and they're able to trade that for, a rubber and then it's glue and then a microwave and then eventually they get like a Ferrari at the end. Well, the Cambodians' revolutionary army would start with clubs and machetes and they will aim for armed police and soldiers first. It was, as Pol would later remark in its early days, a revolution waged with empty hands. By December 1967, Pol and Nyon had made their final preparations, and the uprising would begin in the new year. Now, coincidentally, or not coincidentally, the Vietnamese would be making their own massive offensive in January of 1968, and a few of the historians have different takes here on how independently we should treat those almost simultaneous uprisings in South Vietnam, the Tet Offensive, which we're going to have a longer chat about toward the end, and the Cambodian version of it. Like Kiernan, he is keen to point out how much this, you could consider it a kind of disobedience from the CPK here, to launch their offensive at the same time as, the preparations for this massive Vietnamese attack are occurring. Kind of like someone choosing their wedding day on the same day as the Champions League final or the Super Bowl or something. But Chandler says that perhaps this was, to some degree, coordinated. Like perhaps when the Vietnamese realised that they were not going to be able to stop their little brothers, the comrades, they were at least able to urge them to begin the uprising on the opposite side of Cambodia to the regions they were gathering their forces in the, on the eastern side of Cambodia, on the Vietnamese border. So perhaps this would take attention away from these areas and their so-called sanctuaries, something which the US is very keenly aware of around this time as well. Given how things will go, I'm sort of more inclined to think that this was down to a stubbornness and maybe a misplaced self-belief on behalf of the CPK that, sort of characterizes much of their bright ideas and stratagems, like their desire to simply go for it. And as we saw in Pol's letter to the Chinese just a few months prior, this letter that had so much good stuff to say about the Cultural Revolution and Mao and how is this guiding light, that they were studying the Cultural Revolution and following it, that they were ideologically ready to launch this, their own people's war. Now, the Chinese probably didn't really like getting that letter because it meant that they were going to go to war, even though it had a fair bit of praise contained in it. So I think that's sort of where they're at, where Pol and Nyon sort of are. They've conceived that they have the revolutionary will to start this war, and they're basically not going to take no for an answer. And the blueprint that they've been working out for war is finally put into action. Actually, in the same region that the, more spontaneous uprising, I guess that we could say, had occurred the year prior in Battambang. Now, the Cambodian Civil War will begin with little clashes breaking out in January of 1968, and one in particular at Bay Dam Ran on the 17th of January would actually be chosen by the party as the kind of, the birthday, the inaugural engagement for the Communist Party of Kampuchea's embryonic army, what will be known as the Revolutionary Army of Kampuchea for the next decade or so, until Democratic Kampuchea itself dissolves in 1979. In essence, this was, in their mind, the beginning of the Revolutionary War for them. And, it will be celebrated by the party as such. Now, I do love when these little tiny history bits come up, so I hope you'll allow me to quickly explain one that occurred while researching this episode. And it's a quirk with that date, January 17, 1968. Now, that's the date that you're going to find in pretty much all of the books on this, through the 80s and 90s. The one I noticed that didn't have it was Philip Short's book, which I have here, and it says January 18th. But he does not leave a footnote saying why that date. Now, I'm not sure if I would have even noticed the discrepancy between the 17th of January, the 18th of January, except that the other day I was going over some of the testimony that Doik made at the Khmer Rouge tribunals. And some of it, some of the questioning and some of his answers covered these early days of the revolution. Actually, in fact, in January of 1968, this was about 2 weeks after Doik had been arrested for his subversive activities in Kampong Cham. You might recall we sort of did a prelude to an episode not long ago that detailed this. So he had become a genuine member of the Communist Party of Kampuchea via they do a sort of pledge of allegiance to the revolution. He does that, he gets arrested, he goes to jail. But in any case, he mentions during the questioning in his trial that it was in fact the 18th of January. That was the date where the first shots were fired in the Revolutionary War. But Pol Pot, and this is what Duch said, Pol Pot was a little worried about the date coinciding with a different anniversary that had already been established. Now, in his testimony, it's not immediately clear to me whether he's talking about an anniversary of some kind of Cambodian event, or whether it was the Vietnamese or some Soviet one, or if you Google the 18th of January, nothing really comes up. So I'm not exactly sure what they were trying to distinguish themselves from, but regardless of that, it's interesting to have this example. Another example, like when they decided what the birthday of their own party would be, and they'll just sort of change it as they need. It's amongst a host of lies, really. And these are lies that they're more than happy to promote in order, basically, to have their own version of reality. And in this case, that reality does end up being written down as history. Like I said, it's all, in all of the books, it says the 17th of January. But it was actually the 18th of January. And this is all just based on a Khmer Rouge lie. So, I don't know, it's a fairly superficial example, I suppose, but it's also an indication about the Cambodian communists' relationship with the truth and their versions of reality. And I know it's become completely, passé to bring up 1984 in almost any context now. It's been done to death, but there really is just, it's that idea. It's very reminiscent of 1984 where, history is what we say it is. And what we say things are needs to be what you think they are as well. It doesn't actually matter what the truth is. The truth is what we say it is. And if we say that the first shots were fired in the Revolutionary War and the birthday of the army is the 17th when it was really the 18th, well, that is now the truth. But anyway, maybe these are the kinds of bits, this bits of hot history banter that will end up on the Patreon videos. I know I have a couple others to discuss in the research of this episode. But anyway, let's go with the official or non-official date, the 18th of January 1968. This date when the skirmish at Bay Damran in Battambang province actually takes place. So what does that look like? What does the beginning of the Cambodian Civil War look like? Well, as we said, they are following the Vietnamese playbook pretty close here. So it was a raid which occurred at dawn on an army post. Some sources say a police post. This was involving 10 to 20 combatants for the communists. Now, you might think that this skirmish being held up as the beginning of the war in some kind of triumphant way, that, it was probably a massive success for the CPK, right? Well, not quite. It actually turns out that this communist raid had been leaked by an informant ahead of time and that it was driven off with 2 of their men being killed in the action. But all the sources do indicate that the raid was successful in that they were able to capture some weapons. So you can easily see the difference here between the more spontaneous outbursts that occurred in Sam Laut, almost like a pot suddenly boiling over as those villagers killed the couple of armed soldiers that had come to enforce the rice sale to the government, which then turned into a bit of a violent mob subsequent to that and was given some direction by local communists. But this, the attack at Bay Damran, this was part of a strategy, and it had been planned for months, and it was a sneak attack. And it was not the only one. As we said, a number of these occur across Battambang in a short amount of time in January, and in other villages they inflict casualties on government forces and steal more weaponry. In one attack, they get 50 rifles, which, to go from 5 rifles to more than 50 in a month is a pretty big stride forward, and they didn't stop. Remember, for the CPK at this point, they'd already divided up the geographical regions of Cambodia into what they called zones, usually into around 6 of these zones, with a different zone leader for each. Now, when they attain control of the country in a few years, this will change a little bit, but in 1968 they had the northeast, northern, northwest, eastern, southwestern, and western zones. So, Bay Damran, that occurs in the northwest zone, in the Battambang region in January, and the zone was run by an old school Isarak Rusnim. In February, the next outbursts of attacks occur in the southwest, which was at the time still under the control of Mang. Brought him up just before. This was before he died of malaria and before that zone came under the control of Ta Mok. And again, I am repeating some of these names just so you get used to them, because I know that they can be a little bit hard to sort of remember. In any case, over a month or so, there are coordinated attacks in several provinces of this southwest zone. They seize machine guns and ammunition. Again, if you're thinking of that trading game upwards, having bows and arrows and, clubs, and then rifles, and then AK-47s, and now you're getting machine guns. You're rising up the trading game pretty fast. They also stage attacks on bridges, and they even burn down some government buildings. So by the end of the month, they've done a fair bit of damage and caused a bit of a scene. Surely you've been noticed. And they've seized more than 200 guns in the southwest zone. So what else? In the northeast, in Ratanakiri, where Office 100 was, where the leadership was, the zone itself was actually under Yang Sari's leadership. So what do they do there? Well, capitalizing on their, ties with the ethnic minorities, the Montagnards, a group of Jarai tribesmen ambush a military transport later in March in the north and east zones. Similar violence outbreaks as well, and this is under Khoi Tuon and Sao Pim, respectively. Those are the zone leaders there. Now, Philip Short includes a fascinating little insight from recent, escapee from Phnom Penh, escapee from, public vision, Q Sampan, about his experience this period. And it gives a pretty good insight into what this sort of looked like in a first-person perspective. So he's gone into hiding with communists in a remote village about a year earlier at this point, and he's saying he had noticed an unusual excitement among the young peasants guarding him, and was beginning to wonder what it all meant, because he was cut off from most information and communications. But then he said, one day, this is from Philip Short's book, quote, "One of the cadre came to see me and said, 'Now it's decided, we are going to take up arms. You are to come with us.' So, just like that, we set off through the forest. Some of them belonged to the government's provincial guard, which had Enfield rifles. They had borrowed these guns on the pretext of going hunting, but now they used them to attack government arms depots. At night, we slept in the jungle with a piece of plastic cloth suspended between the trees above our hammock as protection against rain. Even that was only for the cadre. The peasants made themselves a covering of straw or lattice of leaves. Each group consisted of between 10 and 20 men, and there were several groups in our part of the forest. At first we ate rice. Each night the men would go back to their villages and bring back goods which their families had left for them at the edge of the forest. They also had a dog, which caught turtles and big lizards. I saw them tickle fish with their bare hands in the streams. But after a certain time, the villages were sealed off by government soldiers, and we could not get supplies anymore. Then we ate roots and tubes that the men found in the forests." End quote. So you can get the impression from that little story about the kinds of bare bones lives this switch into armed struggle necessitated for many of the revolutionaries committed to this. And those that had been ready for this gear change, and perhaps those that joined as a result of what they saw as these small-scale skirmishes erupted, and perhaps those that were simply, urged by the revolutionaries into this lifestyle, means that around 10,000 villagers, 10,000 peasants, across the west and southwest of the country, left their homes and took to the forest, joining the movement. Many of them probably transitioning into a similar, set of circumstances and conditions that Sampan had explained to us. Sort of, they were requisitioning the populace into the revolutionary sphere, their sphere of power, control, and influence. And this is the beginnings of, what we mentioned about South Vietnam, a kind of shadow government coming into existence. It's the beginnings of staking out their own liberated zones. And by May of 1968, with all of the zones having embarked upon varying scales of this planned uprising, Kampuchea travelled to Rattanakiri to speak with Pol about what they had done. And with their rose-tinted glasses on, they proclaimed that in 17 of Cambodia's 19 provinces, uprisings had been carried out. Later reports would detail up to 300 weapons being captured in order to arm their new revolutionary army. They had won successive, numerous, great victories which, quote, scared the imperialists and their feudal, bourgeois and reactionary lackeys to tears, end quote. Nguyen and Pol also decided that, in light of this, and despite the lack of assistance from their allies in China or Vietnam, or perhaps as an example of their people's war doctrine and self-sufficiency programs and their revolutionary will being proved true, being proved correct, well, they would continue this course of action. But, obviously the leadership is going to have a, optimistic view of this war so far. But give the same guys about 4 years to reflect on these early moments. Well, Pol in particular gives a slightly more sober reading of what this, as he said, this revolution waged with empty hands looked like in the, the earliest stages of national unrest. Quote, "In some areas where the enemy engaged the people, we were cut off. We lacked personnel. We had no economy. We had no military strength and nowhere to hide. No matter how big the forests were, we found no shelter. No matter how good the people were, the enemy squeezed them and manhandled them, and they could do nothing. If people were not good, the enemy controlled and commanded them. The enemy knew the forests wherever we came and went. He was aware of us. We had a few weapons here and there, but we had no land and no people under our control." End quote. So, to me, that quote is a little bit like when you finally look back at that first share house that you had in your, when you're like 17, 18, early 20s. You look back a few years later and you think, wow, I was really living pretty scant back then, wasn't I? The reality of their national uprising was far from an overwhelming success. Communications had been hard enough to establish between zones and to the leadership in Rattanakiri prior to the decision to move into armed struggle. As Short says, once the rebellion was underway, a centralized chain of command became impossible, and zone leaders and the forces under their control were more or less, attempting to fend for themselves. The zones were given an idea of what to do and told to go do it, and it was hard to communicate much more than that. After initial seizures of weapons, government forces counterattacked immediately, and in some cases, like in the East, well, they were able to, preemptively remove weapon caches from vulnerable areas and posts, effectively drying up the resource that was most important for the nascent Revolutionary Army to capture, to propagate their struggle even more. In fact, even the weapons that had been captured on the famous 18th of January raid at Bay Dam Ran, the birthday of the Revolutionary Army and the Cambodian Civil War, well, they were simply recaptured by the government, as well as rice stores and ammunition. Which then means that these rebel groups, they also lose the ability to effectively use the threat of violence to control local populations and make the zones they liberated stay liberated. A lot of scare quotes in these sentences, folks. Steve Heder claims that, quote, thousands of people led by party agents into the mountains and forests were starving. Some died. The rest abandoned the revolution or even acted as guides for Lon Nol operations. The CPK organization suffered heavy casualties and seemed damaged beyond recovery. End quote. That is a pretty grim outlook. In the midst of this national uprising and the, let's say, mixed results, to be charitable to Pol and Nguyen, well, these leaders felt that it may be worth, asking the Vietnamese, their comrades, for a little material aid. Perhaps things had changed now that they had actually, they'd started their war. Perhaps they were on more of an equal footing, and perhaps now they could ask for what they felt they needed. They weren't doing the political struggle thing anymore. They were just like the Vietnamese. They were having a war too. Can you give us some guns, please? Well, you'll probably not be surprised to hear that these requests were denied. And Nguyen, in particular, in a meeting with the Vietnamese, was asked to consider halting the uprising altogether. The Cambodian Communist second in command replied with their now stock response that they felt their vanguard, that meaning the leadership of the party, was in a position where it must take up arms to protect itself, and that their revolution would be doomed if they didn't do so. And it's around this same time, and via the Vietnamese, that Chinese officials also tried to make it clear that this was not the time for the Cambodian communists to rock the boat quite this hard, particularly with the precarious position that Sihanouk seemed to be being pressed into. And we had his comments toward the end of 1967 sort of calling out the Chinese as, you guys are making it difficult for me. So they're aware of that. And as we, in the story here, and as the Cambodian Civil War continues and we get to around about the middle of 1968, you might recall from the last episode that this is around about the time we're somewhat through the most excessively chaotic and violent Red Guard era of the Cultural Revolution, and they're into the so-called Black Years. And what this means for Cambodia, and for Sihanouk, and the CPK, I guess, is that a few adults had re-entered the picture to realign the People's Republic of China's foreign policy commitments, including to Sihanouk, who received quite a bounty of Chinese military aid around this time, almost like a making up for his perceived injustice. And they also made it clear to the Vietnamese that any arms that they were being supplied with were not to go to the Khmer Rouge and their new armed struggle. So with their uprising being beaten back pretty fairly and squarely in most regions and provinces in which they had dared to do, with their rebels being slaughtered and with the weapons they hoped to procure being vanished before they could try and take them. But there are a couple of longer-term grooves that are formed in this earliest and most difficult period for the Khmer Rouge. One that probably bears mentioning is that the Khmer leadership are going to recall these moments when the Vietnamese ignored their pleas for assistance and will probably catalogue them amongst a growing list of grievances. Second to that is the desperation of those fighting in these earliest parts of the revolution, or the Revolutionary War, I should say. Now, imagine the degree to which these earliest rebels feel like they're doing it hard, fighting with bare hands, practically starving, and being very close to losing everything. What kind of attitude do you think someone like that, someone that went through this part of the conflict, someone hardened, what kind of attitude do you think they will bring 5 years later when they're faced with people who seemingly have done nothing for the revolution? Another, groove that is made by this early part of the armed struggle is this need to kind of, for the leadership and for, the power base that is forming in the Northeast, well, they sort of need to entrench themselves further into safety, basically dig themselves in further into the jungles and hills of Rattanakkere. I mean, it's a pretty natural conclusion to sort of draw. There are good reasons for them to do so, not just because the leadership was there, burrowed in like a tick up in the border areas of the same zone, but, because of the conditions in the area. Not just geographical ones like the hills and forests and, the distance from Phnom Penh and therefore distance from government forces. These things are conducive to a guerrilla war and being able to hide from an enemy. But also, as we said, because of the highland peoples that were all more predisposed to distrust and dislike the, in block letters, government that Sihanouk and Lon Nol represented. So, while their uprising, the Khmer Rouge Tet Offensive, as some historians put it, that started in January 1968, Pol would later write that they experienced difficulties. Now, for the party that is willing to lie about when their uprising started by a day just for propaganda, saying that it had difficulties is, that's them putting a pretty good spin on things. For someone that just likes to lie about everything, saying they had difficulties, well, that means it must have been pretty bad. In one fairly stark description, he simply said, "In the east, our bases were destroyed, and our people were killed or driven away. But not in the northeast zone, not in and around Rattanakkere." And perhaps it's worth pointing out here, I want to force your mind down a little path a little bit. Like all countries, there's bits of land and water, there are varied landscapes, but perhaps it gets a little bit lost in the language when you do say that this northeastern zone, Rattanakkere, it's in the hills, it's the forests. You might think, yeah, I got it, hills, forests, gotcha. But I want you to take a second and really think about hills and forests for a bit. I want you to think about any kind of non-urban environment. There are usually areas where people could, hide. I grew up on the coast of Australia, in and amongst what we refer to as the bush, and if someone wanted to, they could probably live out in the bush pretty much confident that they would never be bothered if they didn't want to be. What would it take to find 5 or 10 or even 25 people who have carved out a little area on a forested hill? And when I say forested hill, I mean, this isn't your local trek. This is, it's forested. You could be looking for them for a very long time, couldn't you? And even if you were 50 feet away from them, you might not even know it. But as Pol described earlier, he was saying that even hiding in the forests, somehow the government forces would still, be able to kind of track them down. So it was actually one very fortuitous event for the leadership, where Pol, he was basically giving a kind of how to be in the army, a lecture to a group in the forest. He's dipping his toe into how to be a military leader at this time as well. It's important to point out. But he's doing this, 101 course to a group, and they are very nearly ambushed by government troops. And likewise, think of if you look on a map here, you think about the proximity to the unleashed potential of US military might that's going on in the areas of Vietnam, just across the border. This whole northeastern part of Cambodia, its border is still all South Vietnam, where all of the fighting in the Vietnam War is really being played out. So they're that close to that, as well as being hunted down by the Cambodian government forces as well. And yet, despite all that, this is the zone that they really are able to make significant strides during the earlier stages of their armed struggle. The first 6 months of the Civil War, they are able to take and hold areas in this zone in particular. And the leadership decide to capitalize on this, and they decide to pick up their headquarters and move it even further into the northeast, into an area called the Naga's Tail. And again, if you look at a map here, you can see it. It's this corridor of territory that sort of pinches out into the borders with Laos and Vietnam. There, they establish a new base. It will be known as K5, and it was, again, amongst the highland tribal minorities that the CPK had found a sort of kinship with. This move all the way into this zone resembles the moments where you're trying to find your cat and they have almost instinctively been able to find the area of most corner that they can, or the exact location under the bed that your fingertips are unable to reach. Particularly as the rest of this state does find itself beginning to be set up as we said, this kind of proto-liberated zone. By the second half of 1968, the leadership determines that they have a presence in the majority of communes that comprise Rattanakkere. And even Sihanouk would state that, particularly on these areas that border with Vietnam, his government simply didn't have control anymore. Just because Sihanouk says they don't have control over these areas doesn't mean that his army were not trying, however. And government armed forces were particularly brutal in these areas. Perhaps even more so because of the kind of attitudes that the troops sent might have for some of these, in their minds, more alien inhabitants of their country. Philip Short relays that, much the same as what had occurred during the Samlaut Rebellion, these troops are encouraged by rewards for the heads of supposed tribesmen rebels. And this was soon amended that it needed to be a rifle and a head, because they'd simply begun killing and beheading regular tribespeople for the reward. A kind of mirror image of what had been occurring in South Vietnam, with kinds of search and destroy expeditions from the government forces into areas to stamp out these spot fires of resistance. Naturally, this kind of treatment of innocent people is likely to push these ethnic minorities even further toward the embrace of the communists. And like they didn't have enough reason already to be wary of the Phnom Penh regime for, encroaching onto their land and settling it and forcing sort of assimilationist policies. Anyway, to move on slightly, the Northeast becomes the zone most advanced in the revolutionary struggle in terms of territory in this, like I said, in this earlier stage of the war. But one more effect of this burrowing in, as it were, for the leadership is that it seems to have had an effect on the leader himself, on Pol. The leaders of the Cambodian communist movement had always prized secrecy and compartmentalization as a means of their own survival when they had been spread across both urban and rural areas in the aftermath of the First Indochina War. We've described this in the show already, how this worked in practice with the messenger upon messenger and cells divided and divided across their network. And the majority of members of the movement wouldn't even quite know, what the party itself was called for a time. Hence the reliance on the revolutionary organization, or Angkar, taking such a prominent role there. But as we enter into the Cambodian Civil War, as the party now distinguishes itself as the vanguard of an armed revolutionary struggle, and this central node of leadership is required to, again, burrow in, to hunker down, to escape the violent, their extinction at the hands of the government that they have now openly challenged to a civil war. Well, Philip Short contends that there is a mirroring of this onto how Pol conducts himself at the same time, after this move deeper into the mountains of Rattanakkiri. He explains how at previous iterations of Office 100, both the base that was in Tay Ninh, close to the Vietnamese, then the one that they had moved into the northeast a few years later, the one that we sort of mentioned at the start of this episode, under the same name, Office 100. Well, Pol had pretty much mixed in with everyone else at these places. But the sentence Short uses to describe the change once they established this base, known as K5, this one further northeast, was that, quote, SAR began to emerge more and more, not just as first among equals in a collective leadership, but as the Cambodian party chief, end quote. He demonstrates this via the living arrangements, no longer all mixed in as it had been in the past, but rather Pol, began to set himself up in an entirely separate encampment, with personal staff and guards, and that, no outsider was allowed access to this area to him unless an escort was sent out to fetch him. He would not travel to nearby villages, but instead relied on information that was shared with him from cadre travelling from different zones to report to him, or, via this kind of brain drain of intellectuals coming still from the urban centres. In fact, his wife, Q Ponery, would often travel on his behalf and do these kinds of information-gathering excursions. So, what does this all mean? Well, even-handed as always, Philip Short says that we shouldn't read too much into this, this subtle conversion from mixing it with the rest of the lower rungs of the party to evolving into this, I'm rather special, you can come to me and I'm over there kind of arrangement. This may have been a fairly natural thing to do with bombs flying around and two wars occurring on either side of the border that they were encamped near, as well as a continuation, as we said, of this methodology of secrecy and attempting to remain one remove from potentially being exposed and caught. But, and I'll quote him at length here, Short does suggest that it can be used to suggest a style of leadership that was perhaps coming to the fore. Quote, it reflected a pattern which would continue for the next 30 years. As he concentrated power in his own hands, reality was kept at one remove, not grasped directly, but rather through the eyes of others, as though to maintain a screen, filtering out inconvenient facts between the leader and the nation that he sought to transform. It was a style of leadership that sat perfectly with SAR's reclusiveness, his indirection, his penchant for concealing his intentions. It already contained the seeds of the high tragedy that would follow. End quote. So what he is saying there, and that, what we could potentially be seeing is the beginning of this distance from reality and a cherry picking of information here and there in order to support the worldview coming from the top of the leadership. I think also that this, as I said before, this kind of groove toward that had probably already been forming for some time. Pol and Nuon had already sort of become convinced of the correctness of their ideological vision, regardless of the suitability it had for their country. But this trait, too, might be able to be contextualized by their allies abroad and the projects that they, the CPK, were trying to emulate, or will, attempt to reproduce in Cambodia, like the Super Great Leap Forward, as they will call it, or, as we've just seen, their high praise for the Cultural Revolution that was more or less still going on in the People's Republic at this time, and, as we just mentioned, their copying of the People's War blueprint that had been used in South Vietnam. But I think another interesting thing that we can mention in relation to this distance from reality, or this screening of inconvenient facts out of the picture, is something that we brought up in relation to Sihanouk some time ago. His reliance on, sycophants and advisors who had their own vested interest in either delivering good news generally, or more specifically perhaps facts that might actually have some kind of personal financial benefit to them for sharing with the former king and prince and current head of state. He preferred to make movies about versions of Cambodia that no longer existed, or never existed, full of praise for himself or versions of his life as something completely different, which almost goes beyond just the metaphor of trying to create a false reality and live in it, just like Pol and his comrades will have their party histories full of half-truths and unwarranted claims of success and, as we've seen, outright lies. Like, Sihanouk had been preferring to screen out facts that there was this growing urban dissatisfaction with his rule, that there was increasingly complicated economic problems bubbling away, that his so-called children could never do anything except live their simple lives and be grateful for his existence. And he, like Pol, will begin to see anything that directly or indirectly contradicts this reality as evidence of enemy sabotage rather than an indication of wrongdoing on their behalf. And, in both cases, they will employ violence to snuff out these contradictions to their worldview. Okay, so what we're going to do now, folks, is sort of go over this same time period again. We've sort of covered about six to 9 months from the end of 1967 through to just over the midway point of 1968, all from sort of the communist uprising sort of point of view. So we're going to do that same time period again, but more looking at the Sihanouk side of the picture, to see how he reacted to this nationwide uprising, what he realized was, and therefore called, a civil war from a very early stage. So, like I said, let's begin around the same time that we saw the CPK begin fully planning for this outbreak of war in the last quarter of 1967. Remember, Sihanouk at that time was still putting out the fires of the Samlaut rebellion, when he has this new massive problem in the shape of the country's Chinese Khmer being encouraged to respond to the pretty extreme propaganda coming out of Beijing. There was lots of, talk of loyalty to the motherland coming out of, Chinese messaging. And Chinese Khmer students begin emulating the Red Guards and what they were doing in China. And they begin putting up so-called big character posters. But in this context, they were not critical of, a Chinese university lecturer or a government official. They were critical of the Cambodian government, which is a pretty serious thing to do in Sihanouk's Cambodia. So amongst, just the showiness of it all, the Mao Zedong badges being worn, the waving of the little red book, the Cultural Revolution also had real implications diplomatically in response to Sihanouk sort of cracking down on what was called the Chinese Student Association. Beijing actually sends a telegram through to Cambodia, sort of denouncing the government as reactionary. Now, Sihanouk counters that by saying that he was going to basically send for the Cambodian ambassador in China to be brought back, which is a pretty serious thing to do on the world stage. As I mentioned just before, by the end of 1967, there was a bit of a reversal of some of the most extreme elements of the Cultural Revolution, and by this time, sort of the old hand Zhou Enlai, he will be able to essentially get on the phone and reassure Sihanouk things cool down a little bit. And as I mentioned at the start of the episode, China makes sure to send a big old bunch of guns and ammunition to the Vietnamese, and therefore, the Cambodian government and military get to take their cut. But for Sihanouk, there is a shift here that he can sense. And as Short describes, this kind of represents the end of the honeymoon for Sihanouk in relation to China, where he has a moment to realize that, just like all of the other benefactors that Cambodia had turned to, there are risks, and that true love on the international scene can be hard to find. Perhaps it isn't too coincidental then that, not long after this, he will welcome a certain Jacqueline Kennedy to visit Angkor as his guest. But if we turn our attention to Sihanouk's pressing domestic concerns, the outbreak of violence at the hands of the CPK around Battambang in January of 1968, well, this will invite the darker side of the prince back into the picture once more. And paradoxically for him, the more he smashed the heel of his boots into these little fires in an attempt to stamp them out, this often had the effect of spreading the flames, giving the communists propaganda victories where their minuscule military was failing. I just want to give a bit of an overview or a bit of a zoomed out look at this dark side, and it's something that Milton Osbourne, in his biography of Sihanouk, wondered why this dark side wasn't quite as well documented as it probably should have been and should be now. And he wonders that if, because of the extreme horror of the Pol Pot period, that follows Sihanouk's time in power. And in fact, even in between that, there's another buffer with the short-lived but incompetent and brutal Lon Nol regime. So that's directly preceding the Khmer Rouge. And this allows for Sihanouk to remain relatively unscathed in terms of the amount of criticism that perhaps he should receive. So let's look at January of 68, when the Battambang events begin. These ones, a little like Samlaut the year before, really cause Sihanouk to have to strain in his attempts to blame things on outsiders, which is what he always wants to do. And this is all the way on the other side of the country from Vietnam, so it's difficult for him to blame them. And bizarrely, at one moment, he would actually blame, basically everyone possible at once for what had reoccurred in Battambang. And I mean it, he was trying to blame a civil war on everyone else but his own government. He spoke of a collaboration between the South Vietnamese, meaning the American-sponsored South, the Americans themselves, as well as the Viet Cong, the Khmer Sarai, and the Thai, and the Khmer Rouge. A kind of dream team of bastards that would haunt Sihanouk's dreams, I suppose. Now, Chandler points this out, but perhaps some listeners' ears would have picked up at this accusation that, eerily foreshadows some of the accusations that take place at a space such as S21, of traitors to the Khmer Rouge being simultaneously accused of being members of the CIA and KGB, and being forced to confess to that. But, perhaps to a fault, Sihanouk is not just all talk when this civil war breaks out. He's not just about blaming people in the newspapers and on radio. And we can demonstrate this by perhaps directly contradicting what I just said about he isn't just talk, by the examples I can show you of the way he talked about his walk after the walk. As violence erupts in Battambang, he initially plays it pretty cool. He actually praises the communists for their guerrilla skills, saying that he has essentially been waiting for this, knowing that it would come. He approves the measures to rectify the situation, firstly by bringing back Lon Nol into the command structure, as the Minister for Defence, saving him from the indignation he had faced since resigning in the wake of Sam Lau about 9 months prior. Bringing him back also meant bringing back the style and tactics as well, and as Philip Short says, it signalled the return to the scorched earth tactics that had been employed by Lon Nol earlier. The Air Force bombed rebel areas with planes and guns from the Chinese, I might add. On top of this, access to food supplies were denied, and villages that may have been vulnerable to Khmer Rouge capture were resettled in ways similar to the fortified hamlets program in South Vietnam. Speaking directly about his own harsh measures of repression in March, that same month that the CPK's uprising began to spread to the other districts around the country, Sihanouk announced in a speech that, and I'll quote him from Chandler's Tragedy of Cambodian History, quote, "At least 20 of those we arrested, we had shot. But I ask you not to tell this to the press agencies or the papers. However, I announce it, because the communists have waged total war. I've liquidated them. I've liquidated them with pleasure. And I feel no remorse. It is a total war." End quote. Not long after, he also casually added that, quote, "At present there is no need to send the rebels to a military court. Whenever we laid hands on them, we shot them immediately. In other words, we roasted them pitilessly. In Battambang and Koh Kong, our aircraft bomb and strafe the traitors hidden in the forest." End quote. After the CPK's armed struggle erupted in regions where their relation to the highland ethnic minorities meant that these kinds of small-scale raids of ammunition depots or police stations were primarily done by these minorities, some of the retaliation of the government was particularly brutal. For instance, in Stung Treng, the northeastern province bordering Ratanakiri, the Brow people who rebelled against the government were hunted down mercilessly. Sihanouk personally ordered the execution of 200 of the rebels, saying as much to the press in a rather triumphant fashion. He also seemed to preempt and dismiss any guilt on this matter by saying, quote, "I do not care if I am sent to hell. I will submit the relevant documents to the devil himself." End quote. And other grimly predictable results of this civil war were now emerging. The cycle of violence that we mentioned in part 1 of this 2-part episode was becoming very easily identifiable. Severed heads of captured rebels were displayed in the kinds of provincial towns and centres across the country where unrest was occurring, with photos of these human signs published in Cambodian newspapers. In Kampong Cham, demonstrators supporting the government convened to declare their determination to fight off the Khmer Rouge and the Viet Khmers, and in Kreichi, a kind of self-assembly of militia formed and marched to the provincial chief's office to pledge their support of the prince and his regime. In the same areas, people spoke of the executions of leftists, and Short says that, quote, "In one particularly ghastly incident near Phnom Penh, troops took 2 children alleged to be communist messengers and sawed off their heads with jagged fronds from a palm tree." End quote. Sihanouk would tour the regions that were most at risk of these uprisings, and blaming those who he needed to blame, encouraging local armed forces and rural populations to fight against local insurgents. He used familiar rhetoric, essentially using descriptions that would paint any native Cambodian communist rebels as simply lackeys of the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, othering these Cambodians to their fellow countrymen, which, again, in a way, will echo some of the Khmer Rouge messaging during their time in power, where they called for the extermination of enemies who had been tainted by their association with the Vietnamese. What's really kind of, like I said, these are complicated and sometimes rather old, sometimes a mix of domestic and foreign mechanisms that are all starting to lock into place here. Or yes, we haven't mentioned it in a while, but it does seem that the historical hurricane is beginning to tear up terrain as it crosses onto Cambodian land. And what makes this all even more contradictory is that During this time, Sihanouk is still continuing to support the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. Cambodian military trucks are still helping funnel weapons into the Vietnamese camps, the sanctuaries on their side of the border, continuing to enrich themselves in the process. That is the Cambodian military and government. So we have Sihanouk going around to these regions, telling the armed forces and locals to kill Cambodian insurgents who are doing the bidding of the Vietnamese, but at the same time being like, well, but don't stop surreptitiously helping the actual Vietnamese with their war effort. And of course, on top of all of this, when facing any kind of international camera, he's saying that there are no camps on the border on Cambodian soil. Chandler sums this up quite perfectly and provides a segue for us to return to the Jackie Kennedy story and the United States part of the story we began the episode with. Quote, "While retaining his own alliance with the Vietnamese communists and supporting their presence in Cambodia, Sihanouk was ordering their local supporters killed and was also slowly opening a door to the United States. Presumably by limiting his vituperations to the Khmer Rouge, he hoped to keep his forces and those of the Vietnamese communists from a full-scale confrontation. The game involved many variables and enormous risks. In setting the variables in motion, the prince apparently felt that he could turn his people's violence on and off at will. At the same time, he now viewed the insurgents as a genuine threat." End quote. Alrighty then, folks, I hope that's given you a bit of a tour through the first half of 1968, from both the communist insurgency and the government response kinds of perspectives. And I hope you're getting this impression of the multiple gears all starting to lock into place here. And two of the very heavy ones come in the shape of the United States and the Vietnamese. And we need to see how these two gears clicking into place also has this, driving force on Cambodia. So let's briefly return to that visit of Jackie Kennedy in November of 1967, the fulfillment of her lifelong dream to see Angkor, and with it, the necessary errands of a quasi-state visit that came along for the ride. Sihanouk had invited her, as per Philip Short's version of the story, so we can factor that into the potential needs of his balancing act. But the US administration must have been very interested at this prospect for opening up a dialogue with him. Because since at least April 1966, US military intelligence had become convinced of the existence of the sanctuaries for the NVA and NLF forces within the Cambodian border, and the reality that weapons and materiel were being transported overland in Cambodia from the port in Sihanoukville to those forces. This is not exactly new information for you, my dear listener, but for US military intelligence, the growing sense of urgency to prevent this from continuing to occur would naturally be starting to grow. It was interesting, in the research for this episode, I stumbled onto, the CIA website, www.cia.gov, for those interested. And I wondered why I hadn't done this before, really. But helpfully, they have an extensive archive of all of the documents that have been made available by Freedom of Information requests. And there are more than plenty about Cambodia from this time period. From reading lots of, weekly briefings and presidential briefings, reports, and investigations, you can get a pretty good idea of just how convinced they were of this issue of Cambodia and its role in the war in Vietnam. And from what I gathered there, as late as July of 1968, there were still occasional references to the question of just how extensive the supply networks were, as well as the distribution of the NLF and NVA sanctuaries. But this was really coming down to just a question of the evidence that they were going to be able to use to support this. They had plenty of circumstantial evidence to conclude that they were right, but they still wanted more concrete. So it was a little bit surprising to read that by the end of 1967, and that is up to and after the visit of Jackie Kennedy to Cambodia, there were serious discussions in very high up circles about the possibility of invading Cambodia to clean out the Viet Cong and Vietnamese troops stationed there, which is a pretty serious thing to do, particularly to a country that you are not on the best terms with diplomatically, let alone the fact that you are not really allowed to do things like that in ostensibly neutral countries. Now, this idea of invading Cambodia in as early as 1967, this plan was generally thought of as not very good in those high circles responsible for making these kinds of decisions. Well, I should say at least some of the people advising the Johnson government didn't think this was a good idea. Apparently, this division can be seen in which department they came from. The Pentagon wanted to help win a war, so they saw the logic in achieving that however possible, invasion of neutral country or not. Whereas the State Department, responsible for diplomacy, was acutely concerned about the complications that would occur from such a gambit. It seems that Johnson went with the State Department on this one. But in either case, you can sense the desperation for some solution to a growing problem. And particularly at this exact point in time, because there was a sense that something was growing in these regions leading up to the new year of 1968. In fact, an intelligence operation known as Vesuvius, undertaken by clandestine US operatives, had been able to capture photographic evidence of these bases on Cambodian soil, and had been transmitting them via the Australian embassy in Phnom Penh through to Sihanouk. The reason it was done via the Australians was because this was essentially the international relations equivalent of asking someone else to ask someone to pass the salt at the dinner table because you aren't talking to them. It would have also been interesting to see Sihanouk's reaction to these photographs. I can only imagine something akin to like a, "What? Oh, no way," sort of thing. Because in speeches right up until the end of 1967 and after, he directly addresses these accusations and basically says it's all fake news. But, and again, not for the first time, he does manage to find some insight and appreciation for what, more or less, ends up being the reality of this larger situation when he said in a press conference on the 26th of November that, quote, "I absolutely intend to stay outside of this struggle for world hegemony, which is being conducted by the United States and China. I'm not so stupid as to side with either party, because this would be the surest way to lose not only our national independence, but also our peace. But if doing so does not bring about tranquility, and if they bring war into our country, what is left to us will only be to wage war. This is a self-evident truth." End quote. In the same press conference, he also speaks about the real likelihood of the Johnson government beginning to bomb Cambodia and to occupy parts of his country in the near future, something that Chester Bowles, a diplomat who would visit Cambodia in January, believes was a realistic prediction at the time, and that indeed his visit to speak with Sihanouk was designed to avoid this outcome. So, at the very beginning of 1968, January 1st, so we're about 2 weeks away from the national communist uprising in Cambodia, and a bit more than 3 weeks away from a very similar circumstance in South Vietnam by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army. So January 6th, as reported by the New York Times, Sihanouk spoke about the upcoming visit from Chester Bowles, saying that he would basically be open to discussing re-establishing ties with the United States with this diplomat, particularly if the US would also recognize Cambodia's borders. Now, you'll remember he basically asks every country to do that. That's his big thing to try and do on the international stage, and he says that that would be a very good place to start things. basically saying he would flip the switch back on for diplomatic relations if they agreed to this, and saying short of that, as long as they said they would attempt to limit any aggression coming to Cambodia, it would be the path to at least a relaxation between the two countries. Chester Bowles soon arrives on January 9th, the highest-ranking American to meet with Sihanouk for several years. Initially, because Sihanouk is not in Phnom Penh, Bowles meets with the Prime Minister at the time, Son Sann, and a high-ranking general. Now, the general tells him, as was the style at the time, that there were no North Vietnamese or NLF sanctuaries on the Cambodian border. Next day, it's Sihanouk's time to chat. Bowles had met Sihanouk before, and he actually had a pretty high opinion of him compared to some others in similar positions. Also, he was not particularly hawkish on US involvement in Vietnam. He was being sent to talk with Sihanouk on the back of the Operation Vesuvius moves that had been an attempt to, well, let's say, lay the groundwork for saying, essentially, look, mate, there are bases, okay, so can we just work from that? Can we cut the crap? His thesis to present to Sihanouk was that communist occupation of these areas threatened to broaden the war. And as we noted before, he had been privy to some discussions about the very real possibility of clearing out these areas without Sihanouk's prior consultation. So when they met, Sihanouk went on the usual, however still pretty realistic tirade about US involvement in Vietnam and how it was screwing everything up, and that if it was a war with communism that they wanted, why not go after Moscow or Peking? Fair enough. He also said that his hand was being forced in a certain direction, to hedge bets, as it were, more on the red side of things, as he had long figured the US would leave before the Vietnamese communists would. Sihanouk also said, and this is very important, that he felt he couldn't prevent the Vietnamese from occupying Cambodian territory. So, similarly, he could not object to the United States attacking them there. And I'll just rephrase that a little bit and introduce, some of the quotes that apparently sort of bring out that, phrasing from him. And we do have multiple versions of this exchange and multiple takes on it as well, but you will be surprised about just how important this, comment is. So here's what the US delegation's report on the visit claimed occurred at this point. Quote, "The Prince said that he would not object if the US engaged in hot pursuit in unpopulated areas. He said he could not say this publicly or officially, but if the United States followed this course, it would help him solve his own problem. Of course, if the US engaged with Viet Cong or NVA forces on Cambodian territory, both sides would be guilty of violating Cambodian soil, but the Viet Cong and NVA, the delegation quotes him as saying, they would be the more guilty party." And now the report goes on. "If we," the person is referring to themselves, like the United States, "if we pursued Viet Cong forces into remote areas where the population would be unaffected, he would," and they quote Sihanouk again, "shut his eyes." End quote. Milton Osbourne expands on all of this in his biography of Sihanouk, saying this shift in form from strenuously denying that there were any sanctuaries or that this, happened, to saying that he would not object to US forces crossing over to pursue them, and again the phrase used is hot pursuit, well, this was going to have immediate and long-lasting consequences. So apologies for having to sort of go over the same, time period a few times here, but, we have a week before the Bay Dam Ran violence that will herald the start of the Khmer Rouge Revolutionary War. We have, just a week before that, a sort of off-the-cuff comment by Sihanouk in this meeting. This will be used, in particular by Henry Kissinger, as essentially Sihanouk giving permission for the United States to bomb the border areas with B-52s. Now, William Shawcross has a book all about this, and I'll quote him at some length here from his book's Sideshow, Kissinger, Nixon, and the Destruction of Cambodia. Quote, "Whether Sihanouk actually told Bowles that the United States was free to bomb the sanctuaries cannot be definitely determined from the sanitized State Department papers. And Bowles was too ill to give an interview when this book was written. Charles Meyer, Sihanouk's longtime French aide, recalls that the prince did tell Bowles that just as he could not prevent the Vietnamese from usurping Cambodian territory, so he could not object to the United States attacking them there. But Meyer insists, and this is crucial, that Sihanouk meant to allow only isolated, small-scale attacks, not a vast B-52 campaign along the length of the border. There was no question of B-52s, Meyer says." End quote. So what has happened here? Well, it's important to note that this supposed allowing of hot pursuit, and this being either including or not including specific reference to large-scale bombing, which I think, well, let's just say I personally don't see, from what I've looked at, that Sihanouk said yes to that particular method right there and then. Although the picture does remain contested going forward, as we'll see in later episodes, but we can say that this meeting will not immediately be used as the green light for that. Not immediately. In fact, as Chester Bowles ends the meetings, I believe he was there for 4 days in total, his messages back to Washington aren't saying, guys, you won't believe it, he said yes to bombing. They're quite reserved, saying, we discussed incursions into Cambodian territory by communist parties, and we were able to address Sihanouk's fears of anything crazy happening. But he seemed to have accepted the message that something needed to happen, and left the door open for the United States to move with a bit more freedom in stopping these attacks from neutral territory, and chasing after those that do so. That's my take on things. I don't doubt the veracity of the State Department report, the one that wasn't for the public, mind you. Like, this is an internal discussion of what was discussed with Sihanouk. And that report says he was, saying like, well, I suppose if I can't stop them from being there, I couldn't stop you. Almost with a wink. I think the comment where he said, I would close my eyes to that happening, I think that does a lot of heavy lifting. But as Sihanouk's aide says, this wasn't an open invitation to do whatever. And it certainly didn't seem like an open invitation to extensively bomb his country in these areas. And a CIA weekly summary, and by the way, I've never felt cooler doing this show than when you're looking up declassified CIA documents. Anyway, I found the weekly summary from January 20th, 1968, and it detailed Bowles' visit with Sihanouk, and it analyzes his public comments afterwards that were more or less, like, Sihanouk 1, USA 0. Unsurprisingly, Sihanouk is saying how his awesome diplomatic skills had stopped the war from coming to Cambodia, and that this was a win for the little guy, kind of statement. But the CIA person doing the report here has no, far-reaching consequences to draw from the meeting, presumably with more of an ear on what really went on than most parties, aside from saying that, quote, Sihanouk's concessions to the United States, at least as far as the public record goes, do not appear to depart significantly from previous established positions. Sihanouk did go somewhat further than he has in the past in admitting that the communists use Cambodian territory, but he did so only by implication. At any rate, he undoubtedly viewed this as a small price to pay for the assurances he received from Ambassador Bowles. And I'll skip to the last few paragraphs of this briefing. Officially approved for release in March of 2023, I might add. So, you're getting some fresh new history here, folks. But the briefing at this point gives a very sober estimation from US intelligence about Sihanouk's aims. He's shifted gears slightly to acknowledge the sanctuaries, if not publicly, and said that while he's asking for this to be fixed by making the old holdover from the 1954 Geneva Conventions, the so-called International Control Commission, essentially a powerless thing at this point, and was even, in the 50s. He wants them to be responsible for investigating these incursions. Now, he actually knows that there's very little chance that that's going to happen. And the document also, it points out that Sihanouk's comments more or less look like a genuine attempt to reopen diplomacy, and it acknowledges his desires of keeping the war out of his country. So and that's, the CIA weekly briefing. If that's the spook's take on things, there's, again, no reference from them either that it's like, and funnily enough, the guy said it would be cool if we bombed the border areas. So it can be a little jarring and perhaps stretch the credulity of someone to read Henry Kissinger's statements about this same meeting in January of 1968, and this was taken under oath when he became Secretary of State in September 1973, and he said, when questioned about this, quote, "In a January 10, 1968 meeting with U.S. Emissary Chester Bowles, Sihanouk stated that he did not want any North Vietnamese in Cambodia, and further stated that while he could not say so officially, he wanted the United States to retaliate against these North Vietnamese forces with hot pursuit or bombing in the unpopulated border areas of Cambodia." End quote. So he sort of sneaks that in, doesn't he? The hot pursuit and bombing. So that's his take on the meeting, and it's, as I said, an influential take. But don't worry, my dear listener, there will be a lot more to say about Kissinger and Nixon and the bombing of Cambodia. But for now, we can just realize that this is where the seed begins to grow, and it will eventually grow into a missile. Although it seems that those participating in the meeting at this time, Sihanouk, Bowles, they really didn't think that this was going to be the case. Not at this time. Bowles himself would say in 1971, just 2 years later, in a New York Times article that, quote, "It never occurred to any of us that less than 2 years later we would actually invade Cambodia." But before the invasion that Bowles is referencing occurs, a secret bombing campaign would be undertaken, and it would start, well, some actually say it happens a full year before the officially recognized secret bombing begins in March of 1969. And that's a weird sentence, isn't it? The officially recognized secret bombing. Anyway, some people say it started under Johnson, not Nixon. And one colonel, James Reed, who said in 2014, once classification restrictions had expired, that he knew that it happened in 1968, and that Sihanouk was made aware of it via an Australian military officer working with the embassy in Saigon. He would give Sihanouk a list of bombing targets and brief the prince, who would then warn Cambodian villagers to leave the targeted areas. Now that's a pretty bold claim that Sihanouk was in on the secret bombing even before Nixon was in office. Now, I must stress that that take is not often found in the history books, and, well, to be honest, I'm very interested to turn more of my attention to this topic in the coming episodes, because, well, it's one of those things with the history of the Vietnam War and Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge that sort of has its own place on the shelf that a wider audience tends to know at least something about. If you say the bombing of Cambodia, people tend to turn around and pay attention. So I'll save the rest of my general thoughts about that for now. I might actually talk about that in the Patreon video discussion, but suffice to say, it's a fascinating and tragic topic, and we'll be doing a deep dive on it in the coming episodes. But to sort of wrap up this meeting between Chester Bowles and Sihanouk and what that all means for 1968, it is, as both he and the United States diplomat said afterward, an important and large stride taken towards rapprochement between the two nations. And funnily enough, for both of them, and for different reasons, they have this non-public admission of, okay, I kind of need your help on this one. In the months that followed, and remember, my dear listener, that the months that followed were the ones that were marked by the beginning of the Cambodian Civil War and Sihanouk's fight with the Communist Party of Kampuchea, well, it's perhaps unsurprising that Sihanouk began making the kinds of pronouncements that would actually dovetail quite nicely with US foreign policy for once. At one time, he even called the Khmer Rouge insurgency as part of a global strategy by Asian communism to win control of all of Southeast Asia. That's something that, like Eisenhower would have been proud of. But even so, as Sihanouk once more tried to balance his way across the tightrope by hoping that the US might somehow also be able to help protect Cambodia and stay Cambodia, at the same time, he is giving sanctuary to the very armies that the United States were looking to destroy. And as Philip Short says, it's never simple to support both sides of a war. And perhaps what I would add to that, and maybe it's superfluous, but that is all the more so true when it is a war that was not even just on the doorstep of Cambodia, but rapidly encroaching into the house. So, finally, in this episode, we're also going to take a quick look at the lead up to the other heavy gear that's driving, in connection with the others, the chaotic events of 1968. And this, once again, will actually need to begin in the second half of the year prior, in 1967, when the Vietnamese Workers' Party secretly planned and prepared for an all-out counterattack against the United States and Saigon regime. Now, this was in response to what could be described as progress in terms of the US war effort in sort of clearing and holding the areas in the south that had been contested and won by the communists. This was on the back of, as you recall, massive increases in US troop numbers. Essentially, they were able to disrupt the infrastructure of the communists in the south by dismantling much of the traditional village system that had been used by the communists to make those advances originally. And what you get is these areas that can be considered communist strongholds being cleared out. And where do these forces find themselves going? Toward that border with Cambodia, and indeed over it to the sanctuaries, particularly into areas known as the Parrot's Beak and the Fish Hook, where Cambodian territory sort of extends in these salient shapes into South Vietnam from Svay Rieng and Kampong Cham, respectively. And I've got another CIA document here from 11th of December 1967, declassified in 2018, titled The Infiltration of North Vietnamese Communist Forces Through Cambodia to South Vietnam, which basically details, the trails that were being used, where they were, interactions with Cambodian army personnel, different prisoners' descriptions of how they were infiltrating and exfiltrating Cambodia. So again, when we put all of these pieces together, the timing of the visit of Chester Bowles with Sihanouk just a few weeks later makes so much more sense. Although there doesn't seem to be an indication of the actual thing that might be around the corner. Mark Atwood Lawrence describes this era of the Vietnam War as though both sides of the conflict were actually sensing themselves to be making noticeable strides toward a victory. He says that in Washington, this led some officials to believe that rapidly expanding the war would yield a total victory, involving things like invading Cambodian territory to clear out these border areas of the communist sanctuaries that the Vietnamese had been utilizing. Or, as we saw, to try and work out a deal with Sihanouk so that they could do something about it, which we will soon see take the shape of an aerial bombardment. But the communist Vietnamese war effort was not satisfied with a stalemate either, and they began to plan for this huge offensive that they hoped would set off a nationwide uprising against the United States and the Saigon regime, stunning the Americans and ushering in the collapse of the regime they were propping up, paving the way for the NLF to claim victory in South Vietnam. And then the Americans would have to try and negotiate a peace with them. This audacious gambit would require preparation, and large Vietnamese troop concentrations were built up on the Cambodian side of the border, as well as ammunitions, and this was particularly in the northeastern and eastern zones of Cambodia, necessitating up to 20 permanent Vietnamese bases, and this was apparently in violation of the somewhat under-the-table agreement that they had made with Sihanouk, where there was not supposed to be, permanent bases. In any case, the offensive that they were planning was to be launched at the beginning of the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, at the end of January 1968, and it will be known as the Tet Offensive. Ho Chi Minh, as had become tradition at this time of year, would recite a poem he wrote, and it was read out on Hanoi radio. And on the 30th of January, he would recite what would end up actually being his last Tet poem as they were known. And it would be a coded message that would usher in the nationwide attack. And I'll read it to you now. This spring is more exciting than others. News of victory from the whole country, the South and the North, compete to fight against America. Forward. The victory will surely fall into our hands. On the next episode of In the Shadows of Utopia, we will discover whether this poetic prediction came true for the architects of the Tet Offensive, and visit upon some of the horrors of the Vietnam War. Until then,